All right, welcome back. We are now at Unit 10. This is the roaring 20s and the depressing 30s. So, in the background here, you're watching 2K's Mafia game, playing that on PC. This is kind of a replica of New York City. It's obviously not fully New York City, but it's kind of giving you the idea of what New York would look like during this time period. Pretty accurate, to be honest. The types of cars, the buildings, etc. You can see in some of the scenes, you'll see all the smoke from the smokestacks, the factories, and things like that going on in the background.
Out.
So I chose the game Mafia because the 20s and 30s in particular are very famous for organized crime because of Prohibition. So if you're not sure what that is, Prohibition is the amendment, the 18th Amendment, where alcohol was banned. The reason alcohol was banned was because if you think back a couple units ago, we were talking about the temperance movement where women became involved with alcohol because they were upset that crime, their husbands not treating them really well. They became very involved in reducing the amount of alcohol consumed. There were no laws, so men would show up to work drunk, they'd get hurt, and then there's no workman's comp and anything like that back when this first started. Now, what happens here with Prohibition is because alcohol is so popular, it leads to the rise of crime organizations like Al Capone's Syndicate, where they're providing alcohol, but other things as well. So the main three things that organized crime provided was alcohol, gambling, prostitution, those types of things. And this time period is a lot of fun because of that, but in real life it wouldn't have been, because organized crime would have terrorized a lot of people. But because of this, you have what's called speakeasies. A speakeasy is a secret bar, usually hidden somewhere within a regular restaurant where people maybe had to have a password that they would get into, and they'd be able to buy illegal alcohol, and they would be able to hide from the police, etc. Chicago was very infamous because that's where obviously Al Capone is operating, but because the Chicago River provided easy access to some of these escape routes, because most of the city is built along the river, where it would provide easy access for ships to pull up and unload cargo that these restaurants and other businesses could get their goods and services that they needed. In short, it's just easier access for deliveries, etc., which also ended up supplying escape tunnels. So while the organized crime part of this unit is extremely interesting to most students, there's also a lot of things we're going to be talking about. Like, for example, you've been hearing some jazz music. Jazz music is extremely popular during this time period, but there's also some other things like movies. The first movies are silent, and I'll show you an example of that later. But then we have talkies, where they finally figure out how they can have the actors' voices portrayed in the movie. So we have a little bit of technology advance going on. So this is all before the era of TV. Radio is going to be a huge deal, again, with the jazz music, but also sporting events like baseball, things like that. And different types of, if you remember vaudeville from the last section, you would also have comedy shows on the radio, things like that. So whereas your parents, when they were growing up, the TV might have been a central part of their family in terms of, entertainment, the radio was during this time. And then we'll be talking about the stock market crash and the Great Depression. Okay, so first off, we're going to talk about the radio. In general, this section here is called mass media. So the radio, you have broadcast jazz, as I mentioned, you have entertainment programming and sporting events, but the real one that you really need to focus on is what's called fireside chats. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is trying to get the country out of the Great Depression, and we'll talk about that later, like how did we get into that. But fireside chats are literally a radio address that he's giving every week, and he's telling the people what the government is going to do to try to help them. So this comforted people. That's the main thing. It really made people realize that the government was trying to help them, which is kind of a new thing, and we'll talk about that later with the New Deal. So, and as I mentioned, you have movies. They provided escape from Depression-era realities. So as the Great Depression is going on, movies are a way for people to go and kind of get their mind off of all the negative things. The first movies are silent movies, again, where there's no voice from the actors. Everything is black and white. It's no talking, and they would have little screens in between scenes explaining what's possibly going on. Then eventually the technology advances, and then you're going to hear the voices of the actors, and that's called talkies. And last, we have newspapers and magazines. So we don't use newspapers and magazines that much today. I'm sure a few of you probably have parents who buy a newspaper or buy a magazine, but most of our stuff's online. For example, I haven't had a physical magazine in years. So what do these newspapers and magazines do back in this time period? First off, they shaped cultural norms. So norms meaning normal. What is normal? That's kind of a debatable topic on its own. But for example, even today, you see in school kids dress a certain way. So where does that come from? Because they're influenced by social media. Well, back then, they're influenced by these newspapers and magazines because social media didn't exist. Also, it helps to establish a consumer culture. Consumers are us. We buy things. So when you see things that are popular, many people buy them. And last, they sparked fads. A fad is something that becomes very popular for a short period of time, like a haircut, a style of clothing, etc. So when you see this type of fad in a magazine or a newspaper, it again causes people to go out and buy those things. So really quickly here, these are changes to traditional values. So traditional values are obviously things that many people find important. So the first thing is traditional religion. We have Darwin's theory. That's the idea that human beings evolved from apes. That is a theory. Now, evolution is real in terms of animals and people change over time, but we get that confused sometimes with Darwin's theory of evolution, how we evolved from apes. That results in the Scopes trial. What happens is a teacher teaches about Darwin's theory, and some people become very upset with that. And there's this big trial that goes on that's huge. It would have been all over social media if that were a thing. And it's a big deal. And the teacher ultimately loses. And I think they're fined about $100, which is like $1,000 today. So again, today we have this idea that religion is not really taught in school, particularly science class. But back then that was more or less expected. Sometimes this is referred to as the Scopes monkey trial. Next, we have the traditional role of women. So flappers are women who have decided they don't want to be portrayed as the traditional women are expected. So they're wearing short dresses, maybe sleeveless dresses, etc., which is new, and many people disapprove, but they don't care. Sometimes they're smoking cigarettes, etc. You have the 19th Amendment, which finally gives women the right to vote. Next, we have open immigration. So this leads to the rise of the KKK. With more people coming into the country, the Klan is opposed to that. And this is something important. A lot of people think that the KKK is against African Americans, but the reality is the KKK is against anyone and everyone who's not a white Christian. So that's kind of scary when you think about that. So Jews, other types of religions, things like that, the Klan is against those people. A Red Scare is basically fear of communism, and we'll talk about that again later during the Cold War. But communism is starting to become a thing throughout the world. Not like it does in the Cold War, but still, it's starting to get to that point. You have some people who like it. And that scares a lot of Americans because we love our freedom. And last, we have prohibition, which leads to smuggling alcohol, and speakeasies, like I mentioned before, secret bars where people could go and drink illegal alcohol and possibly escape if the bar was raided. So next we have the Harlem Renaissance. Remember, the word Renaissance means rebirth. So following the Great Migration of World War I and the 1920s, African Americans created vibrant cultural communities in the North. So the main thing here is you want to focus on the individuals. So you have Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, Zora Neale Hurston, and Anne Spencer. Langston Hughes is a very famous poet. Out of these people here in this list, he's probably the one you're likely to see the most. But on a side note, he has a very interesting story that goes along with the Red Scare. Langston Hughes had heard about communism in the Soviet Union, and it sounded great to him. It sounded like, hey, this is awesome. Everyone's equal. There's no racism, anything like that. But when he went to the Soviet Union and visited and saw that it really wasn't all it was cracked up to be, he ended up coming back to the United States. And just of note, Ann Spencer is from Western Virginia. So that's something that you could see on the CSA or SOL because, again, here in Virginia, they like to really focus on Virginia history. So one of the most prominent areas of Black life was in Harlem in New York City. It's filled with vibrant music and entertainment. And the jazz that's produced in the 20s and 30s in Harlem and in other centers of Black population became popular worldwide. I kind of learned that one of the reasons is you do have some people who are racist, but when you're hearing music on the radio, you don't know who's making that music, whether they're Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, or whatever. So this kind of opens the door to end a little bit of the racism because people hear music that they like and they really don't care what color they are. And then later if they find out, they're like, oh, I like the music anyway. So that's just a small little tidbit that possibly helped to reduce racism. So the stock market kind of is a touchy subject for students. I've found that a lot of students really don't understand how the stock market works, what it is, etc. Hopefully your teacher took the time to explain how it works and not just focusing on these keys. So really quickly, the stock market is basically a way for people to invest in a company. So for example, if you started a business, you need money. So one way that you can raise money is to sell stocks in your company. And then the people who invest in your company by giving you money, they benefit with the success of your company. So that's a very brief and simplified example, but hopefully that helps you. The key here of these points that we have to focus on is that business is booming, but investments were made through buying stocks on credit. So today, you can't buy lottery tickets using a credit card because, again, using credit, you're borrowing money from someone else. A lot of people are not aware of that. So that's an issue. You don't want to be borrowing money from someone else. So we've kind of put a halt to that today. But back then, people were borrowing money to invest money in a company that could fail. If the company fails, you lose that money. So now you have two entities in debt. Another thing is that there's over speculation. What that means is speculation is guessing. So people are guessing that everything's going to be fantastic. The over speculation means that they're being a little too positive in their views. Some of these investments don't pan out. So for example, again, if I had a company selling a video game and I sell stocks to everyone, if my company succeeds and I sell millions of copies, then everyone's going to make a lot of money. But there's also the possibility that my game might be terrible and it doesn't succeed and then everyone loses money. The people who invested, they're going to lose that investment. There's a large number of small investors. Panic selling leads to the collapse of the stock market. So what panic selling is when the stocks start losing their value, everyone tries to sell and that causes the stock market to collapse. There's also an excessive expansion of credit. We've had that more recently, probably when you guys were a little bit younger, but where mortgage companies were giving out too much credit, and that is not a good thing as well. So business failures led to bankruptcies. So again, when you go bankrupt, you're not paying back the people who you owe money, so then that causes a problem for them. Bank deposits are invested into the stock market. That's kind of scary if you think about it. So you put your money in the bank and there's no protections. For example, today if you put your money in a bank, the government has guaranteed that they are protecting your money. It's insurance, the FDIC. Back then they didn't have that. So people put their money in the bank is playing the stock market with your money, and then all of a sudden the stock market crashes and everyone loses the money. That's really scary. The positive thing is because of this, reform or changes are made that we benefit from today, like the FDIC, which I mentioned before. And last, literally, when the market collapsed, the banks ran out of money. Can you imagine going to the bank today to withdraw money that you've put in and they're like, hey, we don't have any money, sorry. Even worse, many of the banks, they just closed their doors, they went out of business, and people were just angry, sometimes violence, etc. So that leads to the consequences of the stock market crash in 1929. So the crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression, although serious flaws in the economy had existed for years. People lost investments, which led to financial ruin, and many committed suicide. And there's no new investments. Obviously, if everyone loses their money, they don't have money to invest. And if you're running a business, you need people to invest in your money. And while I'll be the first to admit, talking about the economy, jobs, trade, and money in history is very boring. I don't enjoy it at all. But this is something that's really important that'll help you later in life as you're going to have to deal with money issues in your life. Here in the United States, the way our economy works is we need everybody to be spending their money so that everybody's making money. So for example, when you shop at a local business, you're giving them money so they can pay their bills. And again, when you're making money through your job, that's how you pay your bills. And that's usually how, again, people are successful, as the money circulates. So if there's no new investments, the money is not circulating, therefore more people are having lack of success, so to speak. So that leads to the causes of the Great Depression. So the first thing, overproduction of industrial and agricultural products. So most of you, maybe if you don't have one, you've heard of the PlayStation 5. Well, when that first came out, it was so hard to get. There were very few of them. And so they were selling like on eBay and other places for crazy amounts of money. That's when you have less of the supply. When you have too much, it makes the price go much lower. So if there were billions of PlayStation 5s, everybody who wanted one would have one, and then there would be leftover, so the price would drop because they're not in demand. So it makes you wonder. I wonder if Sony actually produced fewer of them to drive the price up. Who knows? But anyway, that's an interesting thing to think about, and it ties into this. So Americans are purchasing items on credit, which is placing them in an unstable financial position. Again, credit is something we all need and we're all going to use, but when you use too much of it, when you abuse it and you get too much in debt, it becomes hard for us, and that's something that's going to really tie into your life very shortly. We also have the unequal distribution of wealth, making it difficult for many Americans to make purchases. For example, if the wealthy are not spending their money, if they're not circulating that money into the economy, again, people are not getting things that they can pay their bills with. There's a finite amount of money, meaning they can't just print new money because then it lowers the value of the money. So again, that's a very important thing to think of. There's an agricultural depression, and also here's a really big one. High protective tariffs produced retaliatory tariffs in other countries, restricting trade. So the Hawley-Smoot tariff really had a negative effect because, for example, today we're dealing with China, and some presidents have wanted to tax China more or put a tariff on goods coming into America because they just think that's a good thing. But what ends up happening is China raises the price of their goods. So the government of China doesn't pay for the tariff. The individual people, the consumers, they're the ones who pay. So that's not a good thing for America. And that has a big effect on the Great Depression. And finally, down at the bottom in the gray, the Federal Reserve's failure to prevent widespread collapse of the nation's banking system in the late 20s and 30s leads to the severe contraction of the nation's money supply and circulation. So once again, the way the United States economy works is we need money in circulation. If you remember a couple years ago during the pandemic, we had stimulus checks. They get the name because people are given money in the hopes that they spend it to stimulate the economy. So remember, the less money that's out there is not really beneficial. So that leads us to the impact of the Great Depression. So obviously you have unemployment and homelessness. About 25% of the population was unemployed. Today, if we have 7% unemployment, that's not good. So this is 1 out of 4 people don't have a job. There's the collapse of the financial system. So banks are closing, literally out of business. There's a decline in the demand for goods. That's kind of easy to understand. If people don't have money, then you're not buying, you're not spending and contributing to the circulation of money, which again, that causes the economy not to be good. There's political unrest, growing militancy of labor unions. So again, remember, labor unions fight for the rights of the workers. Well, now if you have so much unemployment, people are unhappy, people are upset, and things are not good. And then last, we have farm foreclosures and migration. So when farms go out of business, people want to survive, so they have to find a way to find jobs. So you have mass groups of people moving from one place to another looking for jobs. Okay, so this is the last part, but this is a pretty big and significant part of this unit. This is the New Deal. It's Franklin Delano Roosevelt's plan to save the country from the Great Depression. So first, this program, the New Deal, changed the role of the government to a more active participant, meaning the government is finding ways to help people. Again, think about the stimulus that we had during the pandemic. They have to figure out a way to get people money. So one of the big things here is that there's programs like the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA. These programs are to put money out there for people. So I want to focus on three things to help you be able to identify these. First off, there are relief measures, recovery programs, and reform measures. So this is basic vocabulary. When you see relief measures, when you get relief, you take like Tylenol or ibuprofen. It helps you if you're in pain. So that's what relief measures are. They're direct payment. So instead of taking an ibuprofen, they give you some cash because that's where your pain is. You have no money. Next, recovery. So if you go to the gym and lift weights, you need a day of rest to get back your strength because, you used it all up. So recovery programs are designed to bring the nation out of the Depression over time. It's not something that happens instantly, but again, you're recovering. You need time. And the third one is reform measures. So reform means change. You ask your grandparents, they probably can tell you stories about reform school where kids disappeared. They were sent to a different type of school to change their behavior. But anyway, reform measures, they corrected unsound banking practices and investment practices. So for example, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which I mentioned before, if you put your money in the bank, it is guaranteed by the federal government that even if something happens, if a meteor hits your bank and all your money's gone, the federal government will repay you that money up to $250,000. Because think about it, if you had lost all your money during the Great Depression and the stock market crash, you would have no faith in banks. You would never put your money in a bank again. So there has to be some type of reform to gain your trust in banking. Additionally, you can look at the gold box. It says Roosevelt rallied a frightened nation. The quote there is, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." I'm sure most of you have probably heard that before. But also, if you look at the gray box, African Americans were discriminated against in many of these government programs. I mean, I hate to say that. It's not really a shocker. I mean, we've been paying attention to history, and it's like African Americans are not treated fairly, and there isn't anything that's changed that to this point. So lastly, at the bottom, the legacy of the New Deal influenced the public's belief in the responsibility of government to deliver public services, to intervene in the economy, and to act in ways that promote the general welfare. So again, our government, ever since the New Deal, our government has really played a much more active role in helping individuals. And that's something a lot of people believe in. But believe it or not, some people don't believe in that. They think the government should stay out of that. They shouldn't help. But when you think about things, our government not only helps corporations, so why shouldn't they help individuals as well? So ultimately, what does get America out of the Great Depression? Believe it or not, it's World War II. So next unit, we're going to be talking about World War II, and this basically produces a booming economy. Why? Because we're making weapons of war. So that's kind of one of the things that a lot of people will talk about, is how war always brings about the economy, because we need weapons, we need airplanes, tanks, etc., and things like that. So that's what we're going to be talking about next unit. Why did World War II happen? What are the consequences, etc.? All right, see you in the next video.